I'm Sara McLanahan. I'm a professor of sociology and public affairs here at Princeton, and I direct a Center for Research on Child Well-Being, and I'm going to moderate this session. So, in the previous session, we really heard from the people who are recipients of welfare and who are trying to help these people, and they're really on the ground. And so this session is going to be sort of very different. It's going to step back, and it's going to be looking at the people who are making policy, trying to implement policy, and really administer these programs. So I think we have a very exciting panel this morning. We have two academics, a law professor and a politics professor, but both of these people have extensive experience in the government. We have a deputy mayor who's trying to run all the human service programs, it looks like, and a foundation president. And then we have a senior economist researcher who's evaluating these programs. So let me just introduce briefly each of the people on the panel, because in your packet you have more detailed information on them. And I'll just say a few words about each one of them, and then I'll let them come and speak in turn. So the two presenters are Peter Edelman and Robert Wood. So Peter Edelman, on my far right there, has a long history in Democratic politics, dating back to both Robert Kennedy and Teddy Kennedy. Under the Clinton administration, he was a counselor to the HHS Secretary, Donna Shalala, and he was Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation. At that time, he was a leading critic of the welfare reform legislation, and he wrote a famous article in the Atlantic Monthly called "The Worst Thing Bill Clinton Has Done." So that's to be the first presenter. And then next we have Robert Wood, who is an economist and a senior researcher at the Mathematica Policy Research Institute. And Robert was the principal investigator of the New Jersey First welfare reform evaluation. So he has very much studied what happened in New Jersey, and he followed these early people who were affected by welfare reform for 5 years, following up their economic and other kinds of outcomes. He's also done research on programs to prevent teen parenthood. On the other side of me are the three discussants. So Peter and Robert will each talk for 10 to 15 minutes, and then the discussants will respond. So the first discussant is Linda Gibbs, right here, who is the deputy mayor for HHS in New York City. And it looks to me like she has a very difficult job. She oversees everything. She oversees the Department of Health and Mental Health, the Human Resources Administration, the Administration for Children's Services, the Department for Homeless Services, Department of Aging, Health and Hospital Corporation, Department of Corrections, Probation, Juvenile Justice, Office of Insurance Access, and HIV Health and Human Services Planning Council. So this woman has definitely got the big picture in terms of what the city is doing for disadvantaged people. Next to her is Heather Houstoun. Is that right? She is the president of the William Penn Foundation, presently, which is a philanthropic organization that's grant makes to help low-income people. But prior to that, she has had quite a bit of administrative experience at every level of government. So she was, in Pennsylvania, she was the Secretary of Welfare. In New Jersey, she was the state treasurer. And she's also worked in various positions in the federal government in housing and urban development. So she has a lot of experience with the different levels of government. And finally, on my far left is Professor Lawrence Mead, who's a professor of politics at NYU. And Larry Mead was one of the big proponents of getting welfare recipients to work. In the early days before we had welfare reform, he wrote a famous book called Beyond Entitlement. And since then, he has continued to testify and investigate what's happened with welfare reform. Most recently, he's written a book about welfare reform in New Jersey and entitled Government Matters. So thank you all very much for coming here, and I guess we'll start with Peter.
Well, thank you, Sarah. I'm very glad to be here. I think this is absolutely great turnout and wonderful work to get all of these distinguished speakers. Of course, we could get rid of all of us and just have you talk, Sarah, and it might be better, but a little miscast as a moderator, I think. Anyway, gives us a high standard. And the fact is, I think we could probably call off the rest of the conference after the wonderful film and the wonderful panel that we heard, because it certainly, as far as I'm concerned, told the truth, or the complexity of the many truths, if you will. Mary Gay, I just thought what you said, particularly in the film, was so right. One size doesn't fit all. It's just that kind of sums it up. One of the problems with all of this is my feeling is that we tend to make policy nationally from a level of about 50,000 feet, and we certainly don't take into account, in my view, the specifics of individual human stories and human needs. If I had to sum up what happened there, I would say that would sum it up. This panel is called What We Thought and What We Learned. Well, I'm not sure who we is, and I think that it depends which we very, very much in terms of the enactment of TANF in 1996, and indeed the enactment of the reauthorization of TANF in 2006, because my position about the latter, what we learned in terms of what Congress and the current administration did in 2006, is what they learned is absolutely nothing. And just decided to make things worse based on some preconceived notions. What we thought, well, I know what I thought. I thought it sucked. But more to the point is that, and there would be some agreement on this except for the outcome, which is that we had what I call the 30 Years' War over welfare, going back to the 60s, when people got on the rolls for the first time as a result of legal services lawyers, the welfare rights movement, the fact that there was language in the federal law, no guarantee of a benefit at a particular level, but language in the federal law which the Supreme Court said in 1968 meant something, and that you actually had a right to go to the welfare office and get a benefit at whatever level the state had provided. And if you look at centuries and centuries of history before that, we've always done whatever we called it, welfare, on the basis of discretion, of who's deserving and who's not. You know, if you weren't somebody who had a particular deservingness, like being a Civil War veteran, the basic view was we would decide whether you were poor, which was okay, then we could rehabilitate you, or whether you were a pauper and, you know, you were drinking too much or irresponsible in some way, in which case we would tell you to go do something else, go peddle your papers, or maybe we'd put you in the poorhouse and put you through some kind of a regime. So what happened, in my view, is that there was a backlash, or rather racial backlash as well, because who got on the rolls in the 1960s? They were disproportionately African American, some Hispanic, people who had been excluded previously, certainly in the South and in other parts of the country as well. So I think there was a racial part to it as well. And for 30 years, there was an engagement in getting rid of the idea that there was actually a right to assistance. And of course, TANF says, Perot says, not once but twice, that there's no legal entitlement. Now, I thought that the welfare system needed reform also. And indeed, I thought that through the whole 30 years. I got my learning in what I think was a very good place, working for Robert Kennedy. He was a very job-oriented person. Larry and I practically have a road show going out on this, and we agree that on the principle of work as the very fundamental way in which we put together all of these things. We disagree about some things too, as you'll hear. But the idea that we should have, that welfare should be part of an overall system that helps people find work, that helps people get off and get out and do things for themselves. I mean, we heard Sonia and the others in the film. And that there should be a safety net as well, a decent safety net as well. And of course, working out the details of the intersection between the encouragement and the push and the help to work, to get a job and keep the job, the balance between that and who gets the benefit of the safety net is the tricky question of the whole deal. And so my view is that in 1996, and Linnell, you said one size, you said that the welfare system is rigid. Well, it's really not. It's 51 under TANF. It's a block grant. It's 51 state systems. It's rigid in some ways, 5-year time limit for federal assistance, although even that there's an exception that the state can use if it wants to for 20% of the caseload. And it certainly sent a bumper sticker message, regardless of what was in the statute, that the states were meant to push everybody out to work and get the rolls down fast and by any means possible. But in fact, the states could choose how to do that. And so some of the things, as I understand, that you've been doing here in New Jersey would be, you know, not in the mean department. And certainly I know more about Vermont and Rhode Island and Illinois, Minnesota, parts of California, because this, you know, it's county by county in a lot of places. So there are states that have designed their programs where they really do take individual need into account. Well, so I think that we really need to understand that there are 4 stories here in what's happened nationally since 1996. If TANF itself is the culmination of a 30-year campaign, and if politically TANF resulted from genuine anger, however it was stimulated, however it was whipped up, a genuine anger among the electorate about welfare. And, you know, think about that. Welfare, this tiny little program relative to what we spend on Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, the Earned Income Tax Credit, Section 8, and all the rest, it's a tiny program. Now, $27 billion, you know, as part of the federal budget, it's way, way less than 1% of the federal budget. What we spend on poor people is more than that, but just welfare itself. So it really was a wonderful, can you say whipping person? Is that the way to say it now? Anyway, it was a wonderful symbol to put out there to get everybody all into a frenzy. And at least one thing that's happened as a result of having TANF is that the venom has been pulled out of the politics. And that's a constructive thing. I mean, I think it's a sort of weird constructive thing, but okay. So 4 stories. One is, the consequence, speaking nationally, and the numbers are different in different states, a lot of people got jobs. And one of the things that ticks me off is my wife and I have become kind of, little poster children for how stupid all the liberals were in 1996. And so there's, anybody who opposed this wonderful program. So if you look around, there's a little cottage industry that I think comes out of the Heritage Foundation, and they have these talking points. And if you look in the congressional record, you'll see a bunch of Republican Congress people who stand up and they say, well, now in 1966, Marion Rudd Edelman said, Peter Edelman said, and Pat Moynihan, who can't defend himself anymore, and all of that. You know, the story is just more complicated than that. So one piece is, you know what, a lot of people got jobs, and that's good. But I'll tell you that there wasn't anybody who knew, anybody who foresaw, anybody whose crystal ball was so clear in 1996 that they could forecast the boom that there was going to be in the economy in the last half of the decade. Now, people got jobs, the people who did get jobs, and it's a significant number because, as we all know, the welfare rolls went down by a lot. People got jobs for essentially three reasons. I think we agree, we may disagree about the proportions. But one was the economy was hot and jobs were available. And I shudder to think what would have happened under the 1996 law if we had not had that burst of prosperity. Secondly, I think that the Earned Income Tax Credit was helpful because it said to somebody, if you take a minimum wage job, if you have two kids, you'll get $4,000 more in income. And by the way, to the person who said, what does it do to help to get to a $7.15 minimum wage? The point is, we're not going to have the day that comes when we do it all at once in some big mega piece of legislation. So you've got to add these pieces together. $2 more on the minimum wage adds $4,000 to income. $4,000 more in the Earned Income Tax Credit if you have two kids gets you up to $18,000. And then you have, I just loved the seminar this morning. You have all these notches so that you have to do something about the benefits disappearing at that point. But if you can get Section 8, not everybody does, Medicaid has an income equivalent, etc. If there is decent child care for everybody who needs it, pretty soon you get up closer to actually having an income that you can live on. Not $40,000, but you get up closer to an income that you can live on. So,
20% of those eligible get child care.
Yeah, 20% of the eligible get child care. Actually, nationally, the figure is 15%. So, all of these things are necessary to add to and work on and so on. But the point is we have to work on all of them. Well, okay, so number one, a lot of people got jobs. The percentage of single parents in participating employment to population ratio went from 62% in 1995 to 73% in 2000. It slipped back to 69%. I mean, one thing that people don't pay attention to is the last 6 years. It's not the same today as it was in 2000. And even 2000, it wasn't so great, but it's slipped back. Okay. So one story is people got jobs, but about half of them nationally, according to the research that we have, didn't get out of poverty having gotten the job. Number two, there's a whole bunch of people who are out. I mean, there's a whole bunch of people who on any given day don't have welfare and don't have a job. And speaking broadly, about 60%, the leaver studies show us nationally, varies from state to state, about 60% of leavers on any given day have a job, about 40% don't have a job. Well, when you're talking about 9 million people went off the welfare rolls, 40% of 9 million people is a lot. You can break down that 40% one step further, the work of Sheila Zadlewski and Pamela Loprest at the Urban Institute, and about 20% of leavers, in other words, that's now 2002, it's actually gone up a little bit from where it was, about half of those leavers are what I call out. In other words, they don't have a job, they don't have welfare, they didn't get married. Of course, we're not making judgments about good marriages and bad marriages. They didn't move in with somebody, again, that's not always good. They didn't get on SSI. They're out. And guess what? Extreme poverty went up. People below half the poverty line has gone up under our current president by about almost 3.5 million people, from 12.25 million to 15.6 million in 2005. Those are connected. Okay, it's not everybody who fell into extreme poverty, but it's a big chunk. One of the other things that they made fun of us about, you can charge me money for the therapy of my giving this talk today, is that we had this TRIM model that the Urban Institute had that estimated that the TANF would throw 1 million people, million children into poverty. Well, guess what? If you take the current situation of how many of those people who left welfare are what I call out, and you do the math on the 20%, it works out to about 3.6 million people all together. No, it's to about 1.8 million people altogether. In other words, about 1.2 million children, about 600,000 parents. Okay, that's an extrapolation, because the studies are not national studies. They're studies with smaller samples, so I want to emphasize that's an extrapolation. But it does show you that there are, by that reasoning, over 1 million kids who are really worse off. So were we so wrong? Anyway, that's like I say, you can send me a bill. The third story is, I already said, there are 51 state stories here. This is not one story, and we miss that. So you've got places like Idaho that have a 2-year lifetime time limits. You have 8 states that have time limits below 5 years. You have, Idaho also has what I call 3 strikes and you're out, which is 3 times you show up late for your work assignment, or you don't come to your appointment at the welfare office, and your whole family's off for life. It's completely legal. And we have 6 states that have full family lifetime sanctions, and they've chosen that, and it's completely legal. So the sad thing is we could have had a welfare policy that's like what the best states are doing. That is, in theory, we could have had it, not politically. But we knew how to do it, and we could have had it based on the states that did it right, could have done that in 2006, and instead what they did in 2006 is more cockamamie, everybody on the rolls has to be working, and in fact, so it's not, the policy itself isn't about helping people get off the rolls, except to make it so unpleasant to be on the rolls that you wouldn't come near the welfare office. But otherwise, it's going to drive money out that states are spending on good stuff, child care and job training and transportation and so on, in a program that's now worth at least 22% less than it was 10 years ago, because the money is flat, and there's been no taking inflation into account. So it's 22% less money. It's going to be driven out of good welfare to work activity and into these make-work programs that need to be there in order to satisfy the percentage of people on the rolls who are now required by federal law to be working while they're on the rolls. And that's the heart of the 2006 reauthorization. There's all the marriage stuff that they talked about, and we can have a separate conversation about that. I'm down to less than a minute here, so I won't go off on that tangent. But the real heart of the 2006 reauthorization is what I just said. And so the fourth story is, really I've already said it, which is the experience under TANF didn't end in the year 2000. At best, TANF was a program for prosperous times. It was not a program that was designed to be responsive in a recession. In the recession of 2001 and 2, the TANF rolls stayed basically constant. They've been constant through the Bush administration. The Bush people say, see, that shows you the program works. Well, you've got to put on a blindfold to be able to say that, because food stamp recipients are up by over 50% in that period of time, because that is an entitlement. Medicaid rolls are up during that period of time. So the recession demonstrates one way to talk about the big hole or a big hole in TANF. Finally, I just want to say, let's stop talking about TANF. I mean, we can't stop talking about TANF. You have to run it, so, you know, but let's be talking about, and it came up this morning, some of the questions, some of the answers. Let's be talking about how we get everybody out of poverty. And in fact, let's be talking about how we get everybody a living wage, an income that they can live on. And let's not talk about people who are on welfare as some weird, odd, mutant breed of human being that's different from everybody else. You know, they're all human people.
That's right.
And it's got to be part of a larger set of strategies. And let's talk about the obscene thing that's happened at the top.
Yes.
Because it is not as though we have not grown as a country. We're at least twice the income as a country from 30 years ago. It's all stuck at the top, and on top of that, for the last 6 years, we gave them more gifts. So where we start in answer to some of the earlier questions, in terms of doing this better with the states being strapped and not able to do, and trying very hard to do the things that were described and others that can be described. We need a different set of people in Washington making these decisions.
Okay. Well, that's a tough act to follow, I have to say. Good morning, everybody. I'm Rob Wood. I'm a senior researcher at Mathematica Policy Research, and I'm actually going to be talking today about TANF. With apologies to Peter, I'm going to be focusing on the experiences of 3 states, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. So Peter's provided a very useful history of welfare reform, talked about TANF from the national perspective. So what my job now is to bring the discussion down to a more local level and talk about how TANF played out in the 3 states in this region. I'm going to figure out if I can figure out these overheads. There we go. Okay, so the focus of my talk today is going to be on the policies and practices that these states have adopted in response to federal welfare reform. TANF placed new requirements on states, but also gave them increased flexibility. And because of this flexibility, states' programs now vary substantially. In many ways, each state's experience with TANF is unique. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the experiences of 3 states, and I'm going to focus particularly on their specific policies concerning work requirements and time limits, because those are the things that really changed substantially with federal welfare reform, what really makes welfare different now than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And we'll also want to look at how the policies in these 3 states compare to other states nationally, to give you a sense of kind of where these states sort of fall in the distribution of other state policies. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about how their specific policy choices may have influenced their TANF outcomes. And here I'm going to look particularly at trends in their TANF caseloads. Okay, so first let me talk a little bit about where these states started with welfare reform and how they compare to other states prior to TANF. Well, prior to federal welfare reform, New York had among the most generous welfare benefits in the country, typically ranking in the top 5 or 6 nationally in terms of their benefit levels. New Jersey and Pennsylvania, in contrast, have historically been more middle-of-the-road states in terms of their welfare generosity. And if you just sort of rank the states in terms of benefit generosity, they almost always fall really close to number 25, very close to the middle. And as we'll see, their TANF programs are generally consistent with their pre-TANF histories of being toward the middle or toward the high end in terms of generosity or stringency of their welfare programs. So let me turn now to work requirements. So TANF compelled states to increase the work focus of their welfare programs, and we certainly find that the 3 programs in these 3 states are much more work focused than they were 10 or 15 years ago. We also find that none of these states are among those that chose the most stringent options available to them in implementing these work requirements. For example, although their specific policies vary somewhat, they all offer exemptions from these requirements for special circumstances, such as having a disability, needing to care for a disabled family member, or caring for a very young child, an infant. Now, many states have these kinds of exemptions, but some states do not. We see a similar picture when we look at their sanctioning policy, which is the way in which states enforce work requirements through benefit reductions or, in some cases, case closure. Now, none of these three states chose the most stringent option available to them, which would be to close TANF cases completely at the first month of noncompliance. And this is a policy that is used in 14 states, so it's a common policy, but actually not common here in this region. Instead, New Jersey and Pennsylvania have adopted a policy known as gradual full family sanction. So how that works is you first reduce the benefit when a recipient is not compliant with work requirements, and then after repeated months of noncompliance, the sanction progresses to case closure. Now, New York, in contrast, is one of 10 states that has a policy of partial sanctions only. And how that works is that the state reduces the benefit for noncompliance, but the sanction never proceeds to case closure. Okay, now if we examine the full set of work requirement policies in these three states, Pennsylvania may be seen as having the least stringent set of policies in this area. And let me explain why I say that. First, it does not require recipients to work until they've received benefits for 2 years. That's actually going along with the guidelines that were set out by the federal rules when TANF legislation was passed back in 1996. But many states require work earlier than that, more or less immediately, and that's the policy in New Jersey and New York. In addition, after 2 years in Pennsylvania, the state requires only 20 hours of work each week. Most states have a higher minimum hours requirement, including New Jersey and New York. More typical is to require 30 hours a week or more. And finally, in the early years of TANF implementation, Pennsylvania was very cautious about using sanctions to enforce these requirements. In particular, in these initial years, the state put in place detailed procedures to avoid sanctioning families in error. And one result of these procedures was that sanctions were very rare in Pennsylvania in the first few years of TANF implementation. And in contrast to New Jersey and New York and many other states, sanctions were used fairly regularly from the beginning of TANF. Now, Pennsylvania's more cautious approach to work requirements may help explain why the state has had much lower TANF work participation rates than other states. Now, there is recent evidence that suggests that the state may be making rapid progress in this area. However, through most of the TANF period, we find much lower participation rates in Pennsylvania than we find in the rest of the region and in the nation as a whole. So let me turn now to time limits and look at where these three states fall in terms of that policy. Well, first, none of these states have chosen the strictest time limit option available to them, which would be to impose a time limit that is shorter than 60 months, and that's something that about 10 states have done. Instead, New Jersey and Pennsylvania have chosen the option most states have chosen of imposing a 60-month time limit on benefits. Now, in contrast, New York is one of a very small number of states that technically has no time limit on benefits. Instead, when recipients reach the 60-month limit on federal benefits, they transition onto a state-funded program that is not time-limited. So unlike the vast majority of states in the country, New York from the outset designed a TANF program without a time limit. Now, when we look at these policies a little more closely, the picture actually gets a little more complicated. In particular, although New Jersey and Pennsylvania officially limit benefits to 60 months, both states have programs that offer extended benefits to almost all recipients reaching these limits, as long as they're complying with other TANF rules. And now, under federal rules, states are allowed to offer extensions beyond the 60-month point up to 20% of their caseload. And so these extensions have allowed Pennsylvania and New Jersey to avoid cutting off substantial numbers of cases that have reached the time limit. Now, in New York, where recipients can continue to receive benefits beyond the 5-year point through the state program, the story is a little different. In particular, qualitative studies of the implementation of TANF in New York suggest that in some cases, local welfare agencies use the end of federal benefits as a way to motivate long-term recipients to find a job and to leave welfare. In addition, once long-term recipients transition onto the state program, much of their benefit is no longer received in cash. Instead, it's paid in vouchers for things like housing and utilities. So the nature of the benefit itself actually changes substantially at the 5-year point in New York, and in ways that may be less attractive to recipients. So these policies and practices actually make the 5-year point in New York have substantial significance for recipients. And surprisingly, it may be more significant in New York, where there is no official limit on benefits, than it is in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, where benefits are officially limited at the 60-month point. So let me turn now to looking at caseload declines in the 3 states. And these 3 states all experience very similar and very large caseload declines in the years since TANF was implemented. As of 2005, the caseloads in each of these 3 states were roughly half the size they were in 1996 when the federal law was passed. Now, these caseload declines are very similar to what we see nationwide, and very much the same kind of pattern across the nation. Now, when we look more closely at the trends in the caseload declines, we find that although the total caseload decline is similar across the 3 states, the timing of the decline varies somewhat. And in particular, New York's decline came a little later than the other 2 states, and the largest declines in that state occurred in 2000 into 2001, where we saw the declines a few years earlier in the other states. And this later decline in New York may be tied to the approach of the 60-month federal limit on benefits in the state, which arrived for the first New York TANF recipients in 2001. This limit on federal benefits may have motivated some recipients to find work and to leave welfare as this federal limit approached. And finally, we find that in New Jersey, and particularly in Pennsylvania, TANF rolls have begun to increase since 2003. We see an 8% increase in New Jersey since 2003 and a more than 20% increase in Pennsylvania over that period. This is not a pattern that we see in New York, and it's not a pattern that we see nationwide. So what's going on? Why is there sort of a different pattern in these 2 states compared to what's happening nationally? Well, one contributing factor is certainly the approach these 2 states have taken to time limits. New Jersey and Pennsylvania generally extend the benefits as I described, as long as people are complying with other TANF rules. Other states have taken a different approach and have closed a substantial number of cases for reaching time limits. So this is most likely a factor. In Pennsylvania, another contributing factor may be the limited use of diversion to reduce the number of recipients entering the TANF rolls. Pennsylvania just began a small diversion program in the past year. In contrast, many states, including New Jersey and New York, have adopted larger-scale diversion programs that began a number of years ago to encourage applicants not to enter the TANF rolls if they could quickly find work or just needed one-time help for a temporary financial setback. All right, so just to wrap up, here's a quick summary. We find that these states have not chosen the most stringent policy options available to them under TANF, but instead have chosen more middle-of-the-road to more generous policies that are consistent with their histories with welfare prior to TANF. Each of these 3 states have chosen somewhat different policy options, with, for example, Pennsylvania taking a somewhat different approach to work requirements and New York taking a different approach to time limits. In spite of these policy differences, we see that over the 10-year period, caseload reductions have been similar across the 3 states, although the timing has varied somewhat. And there's also a different pattern in the most recent years with increases in New Jersey and particularly in Pennsylvania and not in New York. So I wanted to end by highlighting some challenges facing these and other states in the years ahead. As I'm sure many of you are aware, changes in federal rules that were enacted as part of TANF reauthorization have substantially increased the proportion of TANF recipients that states must place into work activities to avoid federal financial penalties. So like most states nationally, the 3 states in this region have not yet met those new federal benchmarks, and therefore they could be at risk of losing some of their federal TANF funding. So to avoid these financial penalties, these states, like states throughout the country, will need to develop new strategies for getting substantially higher proportions of their TANF recipients into work activities. Thank you.
So thank you very much. So Linda Gibbs is next.
Very good. Very informative.
Good afternoon. I actually do have a PowerPoint that's much too long, but I know how to fly through it, but we'll have to figure out how to cue it up. Hitting the down button doesn't do it. That's the beginning of Rob's. Well, let me, we'll see if we figure it out, but, oh, like this is way more than I could do. Okay, beautiful. Thank you, Lisa. And so I just want to make 2 points. One, I do want to talk about in New York City, what we're doing as we look forward on TANF, and then I was fortunate enough to get an advance copy of Peter's talk today, and was glad to see that what I really want to talk about is exactly what he urges us to talk about, which is the broader issue of poverty. So in New York City, this is, as Robert introduced to you, we have in addition to our TANF program, there is a continuing safety net program for individuals, the converted, 60-month converted population, without time limits for individuals who have reached their 60-month limit. The program from the beginning in New York City focused strongly on employment, early engagement, and a very supportive structure tied to the system of moving people off of welfare into work. And I think very good. Now, I'm a little bit out of my element here because this is new 6 months to this job, and I don't have the kind of close familiarity that perhaps Larry will share a little bit more with you. But I think New York has a very good design in terms of making sure that individuals, as they're receiving public assistance, we're also getting the tailored employment supports. So very quickly, here's the picture of our welfare caseload in New York City, the decline continuing through the last 6 years, and in the most current years, as we've seen the uptick in the caseloads nationally, New York City has not had that experience. This is a combined, both our TANF and our 60-month population. So we're under 400,000 cases from when we started in 95 of over 1 million. Work rates of single, never married women increased dramatically during the same time period, 41% growing to 65% in 2004. So you see a commensurate increase. And of course, we can all argue forever about whether that's the change in the economy or the change in as a result of welfare reform, but there you have it, it happened. And this is what happened with child poverty during that same period. 43% of the children living in poverty in New York City in 1995, a stunning amount, to now a somewhat less stunning amount, 31%. And you do see this increase. This is a 3-year moving average for New York City. You see the increase in 2003 and 2004. This most recent census report has us down to 28% just for 2005. But it has not further improved since since 2001. So there's a tremendous success in New York in moving individuals who were in receipt of public assistance into employment. And at the same time, the result as well, and we'll talk more about this very briefly on using remaining programs, food stamps, Medicaid, EITC, as work supports, not viewing these narrowly as safety net programs, but viewing these as programs and working hard to structure them so that they can, in fact, help people who are moving into employment to further enhance income in the household, as Peter pointed out, can be done in order to support their move into the work world. So from the starting point here is in 2001, you can see the increase in food stamps. This is a very aggressive, intentional outreach campaign to improve take-up rates on the food stamps. Similarly on Medicaid, publicly subsidized health insurance, and households in receipt of EITC. We have about 85% of our households that have kids taking their EITC return, only about 60% of single adults who are eligible taking it. What that leaves, however, is a remaining population in receipt of public assistance who are have multiple barriers to employment, and that is increasingly the focus of our program as we amend it in order to be both meet the substantial work participation rates that are required by the reauthorization, as well as to, more importantly, meet the needs of the clients who are in the program. So the percent that are fully able-bodied from 99 to 2006 dropped from 62% down to 40%. And then unengageable population and child-only caseload has increased in each of those categories. In New York City, our response to that has been to create the We Care program. no good idea can happen without an acronym. So wellness, comprehensive assessment, rehabilitation, and employment. I always have like a major policy block until I get an acronym. So somebody came up with a fabulous acronym here. The focus is that really recognizing the increased, both the portion of the population that have multiple barriers to employment, but also the complexity in those households. It's often not a single barrier, but multiple barriers, and really working to design a program that does a very thorough assessment of the individuals and provides treatment services and then employment support. So recognizing that some of those barriers need to be addressed before somebody can move successfully into the work world. So with all of that, I actually perhaps feel more importantly now our focus. And if you think about it, we have, in New York City, we have over 1.5 million people who are living in poverty, men, women, and children. With a caseload that has many fewer people than that, what that really calls to need is that we have a broader discussion about why are people living in poverty, what are their conditions, what are the dynamics of the various cohorts, and what are how do our public policies structure themselves and respond to that reality. So that, so I agree that in order to think about making progress for the well-being of our citizens, we really do need to think beyond the TANF discussion. You can see here the poverty rate, the drop that happened during the late 90s, the period of welfare reform, and then the slight increase since then, both nationally and in New York City. And then, embarrassingly, the stunningly higher rate of poverty in New York City compared to the nation, which, if you look back to the early 70s, was not always the case. I was appointed to my job. I came from the Department of Homeless Services and was appointed to my job in January, and was appointed by that lefty liberal mayor, Michael Bloomberg, who said we have to really focus on poverty here in the city. And so he appointed a commission of business, private, nonprofit, and government experts to come around the table and study the issue and look at recommendations for improving poverty. And his focus is the natural continuation of welfare reform. The focus on the best solution to poverty is a job, and what are the barriers that are in the way of individuals successfully moving into independent economic independence. So we had values, of course. Here's the total population. What we looked at is we said in New York City, and maybe just a step back on this for a second, because it was a bold act for the mayor to be willing to take up this conversation, because poverty has traditionally been looked at as a national issue, and I think that a lot of us on the state and local level have sort of copped out on the issue. Oh, poverty, 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 it's so bad. You can't do anything about it, and gee, someday we'll, have somebody in Washington talking about it, but until then we just have to wring our hands and build a bigger safety net. We said that we wanted to actually, in New York, change the conversation and say, maybe we can't solve it, maybe we don't have all the tools, but we have a lot of tools, we have a lot of smart people, we have a lot of resources, and we can, if we focus on this issue of can we move this number, we believe that we can bring down the number of people in poverty in the city. To do that, we have to be really smart. And I think we have to make tough decisions. So the commission focused on what is the composition of the population in poverty and made a decision to focus on subpopulations, not to try to pretend that we could actually first step out the door, solve it for everyone, and looked at subpopulations where we believe we can have an impact, where we have some tools, and somewhat this was a focus on where we believe that there are gaps in our policy making that if attention was brought to it, we could make improvements. We focused on 3 populations: the working poor, young adults ages 16 to 24, and young children. And what I just want to say a few words about in terms of the Commission's recommendations are those around the working poor. And this tells an incredible story. The dramatic increase of those who are living in poverty in New York City have a working adult in the household. In 1990, only 29% of households in poverty contained a working adult. In 2005, that's 46%. And so increasingly, the story of poverty is around people who are working and still not earning enough to move out of poverty. The Commission's recommendations focused on this and had 4 areas where they recommend for the city to take action. Promoting career paths, thinking about untraditional ways that people can move from those entry-level jobs up career ladders. Improving access to work supports, again, food stamps, Medicaid, the EITC, helping individuals understand that those are not safety net programs alone, that those are programs that can be intentionally structured to support the working poor. Asset building and financial literacy, I don't have to say more, I think Sonia said it for us this morning, and focus on creating affordable housing for low-wage working families. There's a lot of information about all of that I'm not going to take you through. And one of the last elements I wouldn't say it's the last element, but with the working poor and across the recommendations of the Commission, we're looking at innovative ways that we can use not just more great programs and building on successes of models elsewhere, but thinking whether there's lessons from other parts of the world that might be brought to bear to work in the United States. And we're looking particularly at whether building conditional cash transfer programs into, as a policy implementation tool to move forward with some of these recommendations might be something that holds promise for gain here in the United States. And so we're just beginning the implementation of this, and I actually think that Robert's discussion of the comparison of the programs, and I really like that observation that he makes around in New York. While many, I think, were critical that we had a program that didn't really ever come to terms with the basic time limits of the federal welfare reform, I think what we clearly came to terms with was a very strong, ambitious, and supportive structure for focusing the conversation with a client who's in receipt of public assistance around how this is a temporary point in their life and that it's an opportunity really to think about how to structure these resources to help them to move forward. And New York is, I think, a real model in doing that. And I kind of love the observation that, that it was that organized communication and message and program structure that helped us to move people from public assistance into work without the same consequence in terms of the time limits for public assistance. So that's us. Thank you.
The next discussant is Feather Houstoun at the William Penn Foundation.
I think I'm just, may I just stay here?
Sure.
Great. Linda's been in her job 6 months. I've been out of mine for almost 4. So I have a somewhat different perspective and perhaps a little bit dated. I have to tell Tony that I didn't realize until I listened to Peter Edelman that it would bring the exquisite pleasure of finding something in common and agreement. Since we started at very different points in 1996 as the debate on welfare reform occurred, but agree entirely that the reauthorization that was finally enacted by Congress plays very, very badly against what we learned, what we were trying to do with welfare reform. The loss of flexibility that's mandated by the way the work requirements really, I think, and I think it's showing in Pennsylvania, but I think it's probably playing out in a lot of places, is really constraining the way states have heretofore created rather customized programs. We were not unconfident about a lot of welfare recipients engaging and being able to connect with the workforce. What we understood and really played out very strongly, and I think is something that Congress has never quite understood, is that the caseload is not a group of people who just exist over time. There's certainly a subgroup of the caseload which was there in the day one of when TANF began and was there 5 years later and had multiple problems, deep barriers, many problems that prevented them for achieving self-sufficiency, but there were also a substantial portion who were cycling in and off welfare, unable to attach permanently, but very interested in working and very accustomed to doing that. And then we had an extraordinary number of people who came once in 5 years and had not returned over the 5-year period. And when you have that range of households with differing levels of attachment to the workforce and differing levels of capacity for working, you've really got to customize what you're doing in your program. I was telling Tony that even though the the caseload in Pennsylvania went down by 60% over the first 2 or 3 years of the program, the number of applications that we approved for TANF stayed constant over that period of time. The caseload reduction was almost entirely a product of the reduction in the time that people were spending on TANF, not who was coming in seeking assistance. So all of that tells you that you've really got to think about what the program looks like and how you customize for different people. In Pennsylvania, we, and Gordon Berlin is here, we relied very, very heavily on the work of the Manpower Development Research Corporation, which had for a decade analyzed the waiver programs that had been implemented all over the country. And I wouldn't say that we just sort of took it and put it in our program, but we basically took what they had done and put it in our program. Because it showed us, it really gave us a sense of what might be most successful for a very large-scale program that has 1 million small household stories, but which needs to work effectively in a large bureaucratic administrative apparatus. What MDRSC said, and I hope Gordon won't contradict me here, but that for a program of this kind, looking at a full caseload, I think the way I would paraphrase it is that there are two kinds of programs that are most likely to be effective. A training program with a pervasive message about work, or a work program with a pervasive message about training. And it's those two balance that we try to implement in the program. The interesting thing that happened, and I don't know whether it was Peter's or Jim Wood's paper, there was a reference to then Mayor Rendell talking about the train wreck that was going to occur in Pennsylvania. And the timing, I think, was misplaced in the paper because the references to train wreck occurred at the very beginning of the program. In spite of the fact that we didn't have a work requirement for 2 years, there was just huge anxiety in Philadelphia, particularly about it. Within 3 years, the mayor and his policy offices were criticizing us for not sanctioning more aggressively because they were finding that people were not as compliant and willing to engage in the workforce and employment and training programs that were being offered. So we all learned a great deal, and I think what we learned, particularly, absolutely without question, the economy was an important element in what was happening in welfare in those early days. But I think the other thing that was happening is that the labor market, particularly at the entry level, is highly fluid. And whereas there may not be any new jobs being created in a community, there is a lot of turnover in those positions. And so one of the things that happens when you are thinking about engaging people in the workforce and asking them to seek employment or to engage in a transitional work program or any of those things, you are engaging them in this very fluid workforce in which they do have an opportunity to take a position. They may be more competitive in a high employment situation, that is where employment is low, but they are competing once they get in there. If they have the proper work supports, if they have child care, if they have other things that help them stay attached, they can hold on to that. And what we discovered was that the longer people stayed engaged in the workforce, very progressively and very consistently, their total income rose. So they had to attach, they had to stay, they had to retain, but they did see a progressive increase in income. I think if I have a frustration, it's the same I think that everyone has, which is that TANF started out as get people into the workforce, not so much caseload reduction. That really wasn't, that sort of happened surprisingly to us. We were shocked at the caseload reductions. But it rapidly became the bar of moving people out of poverty. And we learned very quickly that we couldn't do that. We could be part of that, but it was a much broader set of issues. For me, the biggest frustration was getting the workforce systems, the training programs that were run by other parts of the world to engage and accept responsibility and make commitment to our clients. That was a different system, and it was very difficult to get them to understand that we had responsibilities to families, particularly with children, who needed the kind of supports that the workforce system might provide. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you. And oh, okay, we're going to stop at 1 o'clock. Yes. Okay, so Lawrence Mead.
Well, thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's interesting to come to a conference like this after many focused on the national level to look at one that is focused on the regional level. I think that's quite useful. As Peter mentioned, he and I have spoken on panels several times before, and I have to say it's difficult to disagree with Peter, even though I do, because he's such a nice guy. He's always hard to disagree with. I have two reactions to these papers and welfare reform in general, and I'll say a bit about each. The first is that welfare reform succeeded, and the second is that welfare reform is incomplete. On the first point, welfare reform did indeed succeed. What do we mean by welfare reform? Well, essentially what we meant was requiring that welfare recipients go to work as a condition of aid, and the 96 Act sharply increased work requirements compared to prior law. The second thing we've done is change the nature of that participation expected of the recipients from education and training towards actual work, the policy that we call Work First. Both of those policies together did indeed lead to a dramatic drop in the caseload and a rise in the level of recipients who were working, also a drop in poverty levels. Now, the first thing to say is that that's surprising because, as Peter points out in his paper, we had struggled with welfare reform for 30 years, and we didn't get anywhere. It seemed not to be getting anywhere, although it seems to me that the bases for change were actually being laid in some of those earlier years. Finally, in the 90s, something went right, and we had this dramatic transformation. What was the essence of that? Well, I think a lot of forces contributed. Clearly, the good economy was very important. The new benefits, EITC, particularly were very important. But the thing that broke the mold, the thing that changed behavior on the grassroots level, was primarily the new work requirements. That's the thing that required that people actually change how they were living. Now, it's important to note that many doubted that that was possible. There were a lot of critics, indeed, including most academics and most experts at the time the law was passed, who really believed that welfare recipients were very difficult to employ. They had all these difficulties and problems, and we couldn't expect that they could go to work on the level that the Act assumed. But they did, and they went to work, in fact, in huge numbers, and that is remarkable. Now, the basis of that, it seems to me, was rather different than what we've seen in the film earlier today and in much of the discussion. The film suggests that the essence of helping people like this is basically empathy. We have to understand their problems. We have to get into their lives and understand what they need from us, and then they will change. Now, that was pretty much the attitude of the establishment, academic and otherwise, until the 90s. But that's not an attitude that produced change. It turned out that if you gave people help with their problems, it didn't lead actually to their living different lives. In particular, they didn't go to work, and you didn't have much actual change. What we in fact did in 96 and really a little before that, we started to say, yes, we will help you, but you must also do something yourselves. There must be an obligation bearing on you. You have obligations and society has obligations, and these two things have to go together. So yes, we will work on your individual difficulties, but there must be a clear-cut requirement to work, and that must be in some sense non-negotiable. It's that combination, what I call help and hassle, that did the job. The effects were overwhelmingly positive. Most of those who left the roles went to work. Not all of them, as Peter says. There's a disconnected group that appears to be outside work and outside welfare and other benefits. However, I don't know of any research that shows that those people are actually in hardship or worse hardship than they were before. People on welfare often are in hardship too, and people in low-income jobs are struggling. But the disconnected group, do we know that they're worse off? I have not seen research to show that. We do know, there is research to show, that the states that were the most stringent about enforcing work actually obtained the most increases in income. So the states that insisted on employment actually achieved the greatest gains in income overall. So there's no reason in these findings, it seems to me, to stop the train, to say that we shouldn't go on enforcing work, and I particularly would support the changes made in reauthorization, or we can talk about that perhaps later. The other triumph that's important to remember is a governmental triumph. This isn't simply a successful policy change, it was an achievement for government. And first of all, at a political level, to some extent in Washington and to a greater extent at the state level, liberals and conservatives worked together to bring about a transformation of the system. There were these new requirements, but there was also a lot of new money spent on support services for EITC, child care, and health care. The goals of reform were not to save money. In fact, more money was spent, and no one objected to this. Spending money on moving people into work is popular and remains popular today. So the combination of liberal and conservative impulses really combined to produce a new welfare system in which we do indeed expect work, but we also do a lot to help people that we didn't do before. And the second achievement is administrative. The changes in routines and welfare operations that this involved was extraordinary, and it was carried out with unexpected success around the country. Not without problems, not without a lot of difference across the states. Some states had a lot more problems than others. In my book on Wisconsin, I compare about half the states to each other based on case studies, and there is a lot of variation. But even the states that had the problems had significant achievements. So this is a triumph of government, and that's why it's ironic. A conservative reform actually has the effect of expanding our conception of what government might do to help the needy. So these are the things that welfare reform did that were successful. Now, some things it didn't do, and this gets to my second point, which is that welfare reform is incomplete. First thing, there are still some things we could do to improve work enforcement on the welfare caseload, and that's what reauthorization is designed to do. The second thing, however, we should do is try to extend the same system of requirements and supports to the fathers. The fathers largely are outside welfare reform. There's a lot of thinking right now on how to do that. I'm involved in that myself. I think there's a way in which we can extend this achievement to the men. The other thing we have to do is find a way to raise the incomes of those who are working off welfare. Peter says, and I agree, and this is a phrase coming from David Ellwood originally, if you work, you shouldn't be poor. I basically agree with that, and I think most conservatives do. If you're working steady hours, working consistently, you and your family should not be poor. And I think we have moved a good distance in achieving that. Actually, if families are working and they claim remaining benefits like EITC and food stamps, they're usually not poor. But there are some things we can do to improve that. The other thing that we have to say is that the results differed a lot from state to state. The Wood paper brings out quite dramatically, I think, some of the limitations in welfare reform in the three important states around Princeton. I would particularly stress that New York State is, I think, quite half-hearted in the way it's reformed welfare. New York City gets most of the credit, and most of what happened in New York City was the doing of the Giuliani administration, continued in most respects very ably by the Bloomberg administration, but we should not assume that the whole story in New York is positive. The refusal of the state legislature to agree to full family sanctions and to impose a serious time limit places a real limitation on reform in New York State. In New Jersey, you have more stringent policies, but you also have significant resistance in implementing them by the localities. Newark and other cities have basically defied Trenton over many of these policies. And so in New Jersey, you really don't have a thoroughgoing reform. In Pennsylvania, as we've heard, the policies are actually quite lenient. It's not entirely clear how they've obtained the caseload fall that they have, and I'm interested in hearing from Feather about this. So these three important states are actually quite half-hearted. I think it's fair to say all three of them were pushed into reform from the outside. They didn't really want to do it, and they had to do it. Much in contrast to that is Wisconsin, the state where I've spent most of my research time recently. In Wisconsin, you had a thoroughgoing reform where the whole system is rebuilt around employment. Both liberals and conservatives contributed, and you had a much more positive outcome, in my view. So we need to improve the implementation reform around the country, and that's part of the purposes of reauthorization. We also need to move beyond welfare reform. Here I agree with Peter and Linda. There are lots of things we can do to move beyond that and focus on poverty. And partly it means getting the men to work. I think that's probably the biggest single thing we can do. Another thing we need to do is to improve benefits in places where they could be improved, particularly for those who are employed. As Peter says, the venom surrounding welfare substantially declined after reform. Indeed, I predicted this. In one of my books, I predicted that if we reform welfare and enforced work, we would actually see a shift to the left in the social agenda, because now it would become popular to spend money because we're helping the working poor rather than the non-working poor. And that has already happened to a certain extent. We're spending a lot of money we didn't spend before on employment through EITC and the other support services, and I think we can go a bit further in that direction. So those who want to do more for the poor, and I'm among them, what we ought to do is find ways to attach those benefits to families that are employed. In order to do that, though, we have to make some adjustments, particularly among those who I think are of a traditional liberal persuasion. There are certain attitudes which I think get in the way of the combination I'm talking about, where we have enforcement of work, but we also have supports. We have to give up the idea that benefits should be an entitlement, that they should be given to people simply because they're needy and without reference to lifestyle. We have to require something in return for those that we're helping. And that means we have to give up an idea, which I thought was very strong in the film, that the poor are victims of whom we cannot expect anything. It's notable in the film that actually the recipients, they don't say that. They say that they should face expectations, and they realize that their actions and decisions are important in where they are and where they might go. So they actually affirm the idea of a shared responsibility. But I think the expert class and many of those who help them have not yet bought into that idea. We really don't accept that responsibility for poverty should be shared between the poor and the society. And another point, some of getting the expanded benefits that I think we would all like involves politics. We have to somehow put together a coalition, and this is what happened in Wisconsin, where you had a broad-based agreement among left and right about how to change the system, which involved spending more money as well as expecting more of the recipients. Well, how do you do that? Well, those who are going to benefit have to make the case. And I sometimes think that the case is being made for them primarily by advocates, by people who are not themselves poor, who say this is what the poor need. Well, that might be true, but it has a lot more impact if the poor themselves say it. So I encourage those who want to see this happen to get poor families, poor fathers, those who would benefit, to get out and make some demands. That is, get out in the street, form demonstrations, join parties, join unions, whatever it takes to generate pressure from below. That's what's missing. And traditionally, that sort of pressure was premised on employment. It was the doing of working people or people with a work history. It was precisely their employment that gave them the standing to make those demands. And now that we moved a substantial part of the welfare population into employment, it's time to mobilize those people. They have to take responsibility, not only for their personal lives, but for politics, for generating the pressure. And statements by those who are well-meaning and who want to help them, like ourselves, but who are not themselves poor, do not substitute for that. So in the end, politics is the master science, and this is part of what getting progress is going to require.